Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. Today we're in Tokyo at the French ambassador's residence with the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo. Thanks for being with us.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
You're in Japan for the Olympic Games. Can I ask you what you think of these unprecedented games which are taking place in the middle of a pandemic and without spectators?
For starters, I think that both the Japanese people and the city of Tokyo have successfully organized an amazing event. I'm trying to walk in the shoes of the city's governor. Just imagine the challenges. No live audience, COVID-19, holding the games 1 year behind schedule, so lots of headwinds. But an amazing organization nonetheless, despite the fact that there was no live audience. The athletes performed. They were determined to show their mettle, to show their fortitude. The Tokyo Games were beautifully organized, and obviously that's something we can learn from. I believe it's been a beautiful edition despite the unfavorable circumstances. They successfully turned lemons into lemonade.
I know your teams have been working for some time with Tokyo 2020 and with your friend, the governor of Tokyo, Yuriko Koike. They've been looking at what has worked well here and what has worked less well. What lessons have you learned?
Obviously, there's a sharing of experience between our teams. And many of our staff have come to Japan to look at how the venues have been organized. They've also looked at issues such as health, security, access, volunteers. There's a heavy emphasis on volunteering. Volunteers are the first friendly face of the Olympics that visitors see when they land at the airport. All of these Japanese volunteers, there to welcome them. So we are learning from the Japanese experience and making adjustments to match the Paris setting. Obviously, we want to believe that the pandemic will be a thing of the past by then, and that the 2024 Paris Olympics will be the first major post-COVID global event.
So you did still think the Games would go ahead in spite of the pandemic?
We are looking at every case scenario. Since 2015, Paris has worked to improve resilience. Since the terror attacks of 2015, we have worked to address every possible risk that a city like ours is faced with. Examples include terrorism, consequences of climate change such as flooding, or social strife. For many months, violent protests have swept Paris every Saturday. And before COVID-19, we had already factored in the risk of a pandemic breaking out. Obviously, this does not mean that we have all the answers, but doing your homework and staying ahead of the curve makes you stronger if and when this risk or any other risk materializes.
One thing those of us who have covered these games have noticed is the thoroughness of the Japanese, the great organization and the cleanliness of the venues. Are these points that you'll be taking into account? Are they a challenge to Paris?
The Japanese culture is really big on cleanliness. That's a frequent topic of conversation with the Tokyo governor. Let me give you an example. I asked her how she managed to keep the streets so clean, and her answer was, there are no bins in the streets.
It's interesting, yeah, no dustbins here.
Yes, it's an interesting choice, but it's also a cultural thing. Also, littering carries much stronger penalties in Japan than in France. Now, this is out of my hands because one would need to legislate, and we are unable to get the sanctions ramped up. But I do believe that we need to provide assistance. We need to have an educational approach. Respecting the rules does not make you uncool. It's a sign of respect for other people. And we need to get that word out in France so that we'll be ready when the time comes. Obviously, Paris is no stranger to major global events. We stand and deliver those festive occasions with much creativity. We have an amazing ability to improvise as a Mediterranean people. And those are good things that we bring to the table while preparing for the Olympics, even though we need to minimize improvisation and maximize preparedness.
Before your arrival, President Macron was also here and met the president of the 2024 Paris Olympics, Tony Estanguet. Statements were made about the opening ceremony, which sounds like it will be huge and close to the people, with some of it possibly taking place on the Seine. Can you confirm that? And can you tell us a bit more about the transfer of the Olympic flame and what's going to happen in France?
Of course. Regarding the opening ceremony, ever since Paris submitted its bid to host the Olympics, Tony Estanguet and myself have discussed that ace up our sleeves. We wanted to use the city of Paris as a showcase for the opening ceremony. Obviously, we discussed that with Thomas Barr from the IOC and asked whether he believed holding this ceremony within the city of Paris would be acceptable and or interesting. And the IOC thought the idea was interesting. And we had this idea all along. So we worked on various alternatives, and using the River Seine emerged as a preferred choice. And we probably drew inspiration from the 2016 edition of the Nuit Blanche, the Sleepless Nights Festival. And Thomas Barr was in attendance back then. And that time, we organized a parade with boats sailing down the river. And we had an open discussion with Thomas. And we thought, what if the sports delegations sail down the river as part of the opening ceremony? So this is a long-standing idea, which has also been green-lighted by President Macron. So it's not just an idea anymore, it's the alternative that we have been working on for several weeks now.
What about the plan to bring the Games closer to the French people? Is that just a way to convince its critics and opponents and all those who say these Games are going to cost a lot of money and break the budget? Isn't that what you're also trying to do?
Not really. In a democracy, everybody is entitled to their own opinion, and that's how we grow, isn't it? There are, of course, diehards who want nothing to do with the Olympics, but they are a very small minority in our country, and I understand their grievances about the disruption to daily life and the cost of hosting the Games, but I do believe that the vast majority of the population wants the Games to be held in Paris. You know, we're about to emerge from a 2-year pandemic, fraught with traffic restrictions and slower trade, and we're social beings. And as such, we need to get together and reconnect. For Paris to welcome the world for the Olympics is very good news. It's always been good news.
You also emphasize the importance of heritage, infrastructure and district renovation. Can that also help convince the French?
You're absolutely right. You know, legacy is always top of mind when hosting Olympic or Paralympic Games. You worry about the ultimate usefulness of the infrastructure that you build. It's not just a big party and a celebration of amazing athletes for 2 weeks. What legacy do we leave behind, and how useful is it going to be? So my answer to this question is this. First and foremost, we're contributing to the greater Paris area, and we're helping to transform the Seine-Saint-Denis region, which needed that extra oomph. Absolutely. Seine-Saint-Denis is one of our country's poorest départements, one of the most diverse, ethnically speaking, and also it has one of the youngest populations. And the Olympics bring people together, particularly young people who originate from all around the world. The Olympics will also help us fast-track the environmental transition. In particular, we want to clean up the River Seine. We want to make its waters so pristine that after the Games, the population of Paris can swim there again. That's our legacy. And that's one of our motivations, making the Olympics work for us, creating jobs, and also focusing on ethics. That's key as well. We're about to welcome the whole world. Obviously, we need to be on our best behavior. We need to show the world the best version of ourselves. We need to showcase French-style creativity, our culture, our universal values. That's our trademark. And it's very exciting.
2024 isn't far away, but at the same time, a lot can happen between now and then. We're all thinking about next year's presidential elections, and you're a potential candidate. If you do run, what would that mean for the organisation of Paris 2024?
Obviously, this is neither the time or place to talk about that. But as you well know, the presidential elections will be held halfway through the pre-Olympics period. Presidential elections are obviously a highlight of democracy, an important time for our country, and I really don't think that the Olympics will be a campaign issue. Whichever end of the political spectrum wins the election eventually, whatever the country's leadership will be, I believe there is a very broad consensus. Yes, there's a handful of political figures or groups which may disagree, but I do believe that there is a continuity of views. We are all driven by the need to make the Olympics work for our country. That's our main goal.
Let's end on that positive note. And Hidalgo, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. That brings us to the end of the interview on France 24. Stay with us for the international news.